Hello, Matt, and welcome. Thanks so much for joining me today. We are about to dive into your fantastic new book, Mastering Uncertainty. I have it here. It just came out. And first of all, I wanted to ask you, Rory Sutherland, vice chairman of the Ogilvy Group, said something really interesting about the book. He said management consultants will hate this book while secretly agreeing with it. Why is that?
Wow, okay, that's a great opening question. I think the point that he's trying to make is that much of what is sold in the consulting world is the promise of certainty and the promise of predictability and very clear kind of guaranteed outcomes, because they often sell, if you follow our process, you get A, or just do it our way and you're guaranteed to get B. And what they also typically sell is not success per se, it's more not failing. And the approaches that you take to things, if you're looking to have a very large payoff, are very different to the approaches that you take to things if you're just looking to not fail, right? Because I think people instinctively understand that there's some kind of relationship between risk and reward, and that it's only kind of big, outlandish ideas that have the potential to go on to become huge successes that maybe change an industry or become a smash hit new business with customers, but those obviously entail a tremendous amount of risk, right? There's kind of not a lot of getting around that. So the mentality that you take to simply avoid risk isn't the same as the approach that you take to doing things if you actually want to really innovate with things. So I think the reason that Rory is saying that is because the way that they typically sell their services and the promise that they're typically making is, we're going to eliminate uncertainty, we're going to eliminate risk, we're going to try and eliminate all the unknowns. But that's not really what we want to do if we want to really innovate, if we want to really do new things, if we really want to get big payoffs. This book, Mastering Uncertainty, makes it very clear that there is no certainty. There are no guaranteed outcomes. And if the approach that you take is just to really try and minimize or eliminate risk, you're going to be locked into very minor tweaks and incremental improvements to what you already do, which is not often what people really want. So there's the kind of consultative approach, and then there's the kind of entrepreneurial approach, and they're very, very different. And we compare and contrast those in the book. So that, I think, is why he said that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Mastering Uncertainty is your third book. I was really intrigued by the evolution of your thinking that you explain in the introduction. Can you tell us a bit more about that, about your first two books, The 10 Principles Behind Great Customer Experience and The Grid, and what led you to Mastering Uncertainty?
Yeah, sure. So when I wrote my first book, it's now been out for 10 years, and it was in the works for a couple of years before that. So we're talking about, almost 12 years ago now. At that time, I was really involved in designing software and websites and multi-channel customer experiences where we were trying to integrate all of these things. I'd been taught, having grown up in a household with my dad, who was an engineer, to try and think about things from first principles, right? So how the way to make better decisions, more consistent decisions, more consistently good decisions, or more efficient decisions, is to try and understand the rudiments of a field, understand the theoretical knowledge that underpins it. And if you can master that, then you can make better decisions. And so I was always thinking, well, what are the what are the theories or principles that apply to designing great customer experiences for things that people love to interact with. And obviously there are some general principles. So, for example, our satisfaction depends on our expectations. So have we set and met clear expectations in this experience, right? That would be one. We know that people prefer things, surprise, surprise, that are easier to use rather than that are more difficult to use, right? So how are we going about systematically reducing the amount of effort required from this product or service or interaction, so on and so forth. So the bigger realization was that in any domain, any specific domain or discipline, whether it's design, architecture, marketing, civil engineering, doesn't matter, there are some principles at work, and if you know them, then you have an advantage in your decision making, right? So I was in that domain of customer experience, so those are the principles that I wrote about. What happened as a consequence of the kind of success of that book, which did really well, it won the CMI Management Book of the Year award when it came out, was that a new kind of slew of clients came in who didn't really, in their mind, I guess, see me as somebody who actually designed or made things, which is what I'd always been. They wanted me to talk more about strategy and that kind of thing, which I didn't really know anything about, and I honestly wasn't really interested in. But one thing that I learned through those experiences was that at that level in the organization, let's call it like middle to upper management, the type of people who started to engage me at that point, I noticed that people just assumed they had problems rather than figuring out what they actually did. There was very little thought put into getting to the root cause of what the problem might be, and also very little consideration for how changing things in one area of the business might affect the other. So what I thought was needed was a way to help people to think in systems, right, which is what The Grid is about, the second book. So if we're to kind of zoom out a bit, principles and theory help you very well if you're working within a specific domain. But as soon as you have an organization, you're combining the skills and insights of many different disciplines and domains, right? You're not just talking about UX design. Now we've got to, make trade-offs basically between how much we spend on marketing, how much we spend on product development, how much we budget for customer experience, how much we allocate to acquiring new customers, how much we allocate to retaining existing customers, all of that kind of stuff. So you find yourself in the world of systems thinking. So you go from principle-based thinking to systems-based thinking. When you start to think in systems, you then realize, well, a lot of the factors that actually determine our success or how well our system functions are beyond our control. So then you realize we're actually dealing with probabilities in pretty much everything in business. So the three books basically go principles, systems, probabilities. And these are the three kind of modalities of thinking, I guess, that apply in business. And if you can understand them, all three of them, and if you can realize which type of thinking is best going to apply to which situation, then you have a real advantage in your decision making and your approach. And it basically just follows my own trajectory of what I've learned and what I've seen in my own kind of career progression, starting from being a web designer basically through to kind of being an entrepreneur.
That's very interesting. And in the book, you talk about how we actually live in a world of complex adaptive systems.
Yeah.
I was wondering, there seems to be a lot of talk around decision making based on historical data. If we do live in a world of complex adaptive systems, what do you think about this increasing reliance on decision making that's basically driven by past performance?
Yeah, that's a very interesting topic to explore. And I actually just read the draft of a book, an early draft of a book written by a friend of mine who's writing about how data is used in organizations to make decisions. And it's really interesting that I think, and he kind of makes this point, that we've probably never had more data than we have now. In fact, that's certainly true, I think. But it's not helping us to make better decisions. Because to make better decisions, you need to process that data in such a way that it leads to an insight. And then you need to use that insight in such a way that it helps you make decisions. Right? And decision making isn't really data driven. I think that's a kind of a misnomer, in the data that you're gathering and the way that you're using it should always be a function of a business problem or opportunity that you're trying to better understand. So businesses aren't really data driven; they should be strategy or need driven in that regard. So just kind of gathering more and more and more data and believing that it's going to miraculously result in best decision making is it's not really true. Also, there are certain things in life that are where past performance is a reliable indicator of what's going to happen in the future. I mean, we know what time the sun's going to rise and set every day. We've got quite a lot of data on that. We know like tidal patterns and that kind of thing. But a lot of what happens in business is driven by power laws and kind of black swan events, to use the kind of colloquial term, which are high impact and low predictability. So part of the challenge for organizations that want to make decisions based on data is that the world often looks like it's predictable, and it often looks like data from the past can be extrapolated out to predict the future. And that works until suddenly it doesn't, because events happen all the time that mean that actually the future won't at all be like the past. So like we might have a pattern that's going up and down and up and down like a sine wave, but if our assumption is that it just carries on going up, then when it suddenly starts to swing down, we're using the wrong model. I think in general, and I would kind of include myself in this, we're very data illiterate. Like most people don't know anything at all about statistics, statistical modeling. They don't realize that at every step of the way, from what data we gather to how we aggregate and analyze and clean and process and present it, we're making subjective decisions at every point. As soon as I decide to make this bar chart blue, for example, or what the scale should be, I'm putting my own slant on it. There's no such thing as objective data. And so people just need to, I think, in general, increase their data literacy. And that's what my friend's book is hoping to do. And I think it's very, very necessary.
Thank you. I would like to ask you more about the mindset. So I think we do spend a lot of time planning, creating business strategies that perhaps, predict the market. We say, this is how our career or how our business will look like in 5 years. That we set goals and the revenues we want to generate. And sometimes we do it, we become a bit too focused, we become a bit too strict with those goals that we set. How do we peel back from this mindset of planning and trying to always map the future? And how do we learn to navigate the terrain instead?
I think it really depends on context. So all of these decisions and all of these answers and all of these questions are going to depend really on the context that you're dealing with, right? So there are a lot of industries or product categories which are kind of mature and stable and pretty well understood, So in those circumstances, what most people are talking about is this idea of of exploitative growth, right? We know the category exists, we know the product exists, we know demand exists, we know the basic industry dynamics, we know who has what market share, we know the kind of growth rate of that industry, and things seem relatively orderly and stable, right? Most categories form, then they go through a period of growth, then they kind of plateau, and then they decline as they're eventually replaced with something else, right? So when we're talking about those things that you mentioned about revenue targets and this, that, and the other, what we're really talking about is we're talking about established categories where we're going after exploitative growth, right? All makes sense. But there's another way of growing, which is exploratory. So you've got exploit and explore. Exploration is looking for new opportunities, maybe entering entirely new categories, maybe creating entirely new types of products or service. Bezos, for example, is talking about combining these two approaches. He says, yes, there are plenty of things where we can be efficient and we can all be orderly and we can set goals, but then we also need to explore and we need to try things, we need to experiment with things, and we basically need to place bets, and sometimes those bets will pay off and sometimes they won't, but you only need one big winning bet and it covers the cost of a lot of losers and it can transform your business. If you look at a company like Dyson, they have continued to improve bagless vacuum cleaners, but then they've also gone into making hand dryers, right? A really innovative design of a hand dryer. And then they've gone into hair dryers, right? And each time they've kind of brought a radical product to those old categories. So they're exploring as well as exploiting. The thing is to understand, first of all, are we trying to exploit or are we trying to explore? Because if you're trying to exploit, fine, there's pretty well understood how a lot of that stuff works. But if you're trying to explore, the exploit models of massive upfront planning and setting revenue targets and very clear roadmaps doesn't work because there's way too much uncertainty involved. Instead, what you're really trying to do is you can't be working from this return on investment driven approach. You need to be working on the basis of affordable loss. You need to be trying new ideas out. You need to be placing bets. You need to be running low cost experiments. You need to be working in a very different idiom. So it really depends on which of these you're trying to do, and to acknowledge that maybe the approach that you take to one isn't the approach that you take to the other, and that the working practice of entrepreneurs trying to launch an entirely new business where there's tremendous uncertainty is necessarily very different from the working practice of, a division head at a massively established company that's working in a kind of relatively stable category that's been around for decades.
In the book, you talk about uncertainty in the context of an individual, their career and their life, and then in the context of companies and organizations.
Yeah.
And I want to touch a bit more about the uncertainty in an individual's life.
Yeah.
Today's world is so increasingly interconnected, and the networks and community are becoming increasingly more important. What are some of the core principles our members can hold on to be more equipped to manage the complexity of the business world, but also the world in general?
Yeah, so I think in many ways this is the aspect of the book or the topic that most excites me. Really, is the potential for individuals to thrive basically by transforming their relationship with uncertainty and their understanding of of serendipity. So the way that I like to have this conversation with people is to say, think about how you met one of the most important people in your life, or think about how some amazing, like, life-changing event came about. Maybe it's how you discovered a passion for something, or how you got started in your career, or how you ended up in your current job, or whatever it might be, or how you met your husband, wife, partner, best friend, business partner, whatever. And when you do that, anybody who's really trying to answer that honestly, you realize that an extraordinary kind of confluence of factors must have come together to put you and that person in the same place at the same time, right? Or to have put you in a context where that opportunity could have played out, right? It's amazing what must have had to happen. So you realize that you're basically dealing with the upside of randomness that we kind of call serendipity. I was in the right place at the right time. I just happened to have been born in this year, or I just happened to have gone from this school, or I just happened to have been standing on that train platform, or I just happened to have gone to this party. And in all of these things, you could probably never have predicted what was going to happen. And yet there was this amazing kind of outcome. Now, when you realize that, you realize that the aim of the game really is to increase the likelihood of these serendipitous events occurring, right? It's not necessarily to have a plan and then execute it. It's to say, how can I increase what you would call your luck surface area? How can I do that? And there are many, many practical ways that you can go about doing that. So the first thing that you can do is, if you're confronted with a situation and you aren't really sure what will happen. So let's say I'm appearing on this podcast, right? I don't know what's going to happen as a consequence of doing it. I don't know whether 1,000 new people are going to buy the book. I don't know whether someone's going to send me an email saying, I heard your podcast, I'm really interested in this, and I made some new business contact or friend or whatever. I don't know. But I do know that if I don't record the podcast, nothing happens, right? So the thing to ask yourself in most social circumstances or in your personal life is, what's my downside? Not what's my upside and how can I guarantee it, which is a completely different way of thinking about it. So one thing we can do is say, what's my downside? And if my downside is acceptable, just go ahead. The second thing that we can do is we can try and be people who are willing to go first with things, because, as the saying goes, I miss 100% of the shots I don't take. I can't win the lottery if I don't buy a ticket. So just by being the type of person who's prepared to initiate things, like to reach out to somebody and say, could you help me with this? Or I'm interested in your perspective on this. Or would you like to get together for coffee? Or would you like to marry me? Or, whatever it might be. People who are prepared to go first and actually initiate things have an unfair advantage. What else can we do? The golden rule, I think, in general, is you should aspire to be a host in life, not a guest, right? Which is a really powerful way of thinking about things. What does a host do? Well, they look for ways that they can create value for other people. They are attentive to individuals' needs and try and cater to them. They look at other people they know and think, how could I put those people together who might benefit from knowing one another? Right? You're basically paying it forward, and then through some kind of karmic, mystic functioning of the universe, it kind of comes back around to you. The other thing that you can do is you can through social media or whatever it might be, communicate to more people what you're passionate about or what your goals are or what you're working on. Because if people know, then they might either come forth to help you, or they might be interested in the same thing, or they might know somebody who's interested in the same thing. So talking more and being more vocal actually about your interests and your passions is a way of attracting more people into your life. And then when you have more social capital, better relationships, that kind of thing, it's natural that kind of opportunity starts to be generated as a byproduct of that. There's a kind of mentality that's very popular in the business world, particularly in the academic community, that opportunities already exist and it's our job to kind of excavate them from the market using like clever analysis and strategy and data and all of that kind of stuff. It doesn't really work like that. The way that it works is that we meet people. Together, we create opportunity. That's how it works. Like if you look at every success story, and obviously I wrote about this in the book, there's like story A, which is this kind of story of the business in a very cold, kind of calculating, functional way. This was our strategic insight. This was our process. This was our strategy. But then there's story B, which is how those people came to be working on it in the first place, which is often extremely random and completely unpredictable. But without that kind of serendipity, without that story B, there is no story A. Right? So what we really want to be doing is having more story Bs, meeting more people, creating more opportunities, and just being open to the possibility that serendipitous events are happening all around us all the time. And it's up to us whether we want to make opportunities from them.
I love that there's also a backstory there, because it was a serendipitous meeting with Csaba as well, who co-wrote the book with you. And I really enjoyed that fun fact. But my final question to you is about the final chapter in the book. It's called Lessons for Leaders. What can you tell us about the role that company culture plays in company's resilience and the ability for the company to weather the storm of uncertainty?
Uncertainty is everywhere. And our relationship with uncertainty, if you stop and think about it, has profound implications for just about every single aspect of our lives. Right? And we've already talked about a few of those. It affects how you cope with setbacks, because they might just have happened because that's the hand that you're dealt because of the randomness in the world. Do you see them as failings, or do you see them as learning opportunities? It affects how you would go about starting a new business. It affects whether you even have the courage to try and start something new. It affects how you go about building relationships. It affects how you might go about trying to further your career. It affects how you would think about growing a business. And it also affects your management style, your leadership style, the incentives that you would set, the behaviors that you would reward, and the behaviors that you would discourage. For fairly obvious reasons, right? So let's say we have one mindset where we really acknowledge, hey, this is anyone's guess. We don't know what's going to happen, right? If that's your mindset, you're going to encourage experimentation. And if experiments don't work, you're going to say, that's okay. What did we learn from it? Let's call that like approach A. Let's say we've got approach B, which is no. The world is predictable. The world is knowable. Business is a math equation to be solved. It's a science. Think about the implications of that mindset for if what you try doesn't work. If what you try doesn't work and that's your mindset, it's we gathered the wrong data, we had the wrong strategy, we did the wrong analysis. It's an indictment of our abilities. We failed, it's our fault, we should be punished. All the people who failed should be punished. It's not difficult to see how those very, very different relationships with uncertainty would result in very, very different cultures, or very, very different leadership styles, or very, very different management styles. One, where people are curious about the world around them, willing to try new things, open-minded, running experiments, testing new ideas, sharing what they learn, celebrating their successes, analyzing their failures and hoping to learn from them for the future. And another kind of culture where bad information is suppressed, errors are hidden or covered up, all of the money goes in gathering more and more and more data and analyzing it. All of the strategy and decision making is driven by aversion of risk. You can see that so much of this comes from your relationship with uncertainty and the relationship that the leadership and management have in terms of their relationship with uncertainty and how much they acknowledge it, right? And so I think that a lot of the problems that we have in organizations where we don't have this psychological safety, where everything becomes like ultra politicized, where senior decision makers are starved of the information they need to make good decisions, where it's considered political to talk about objective reality and share what's considered bad news, comes because these organizations have created a culture that's founded on a total misunderstanding about how the world works. It's not, we don't live in a world where everything works like a clockwork machine. We live in a world where there's uncertainty, randomness, there's a connection between risk and reward. And one thing's absolutely for sure, if you create a culture where it's not possible for people to have a different opinion, where everything has to be driven by consensus, where if when people make honest mistakes, they're punished for it rather than it's shared and everybody learns from it, you're never going to be able to thrive in an unpredictable world. And your days are numbered, basically, because you're not going to be able to innovate or respond to change. And it's really just as simple as that.
Thanks so much again for taking the time to join me today. I know our members will find this conversation so useful, and I know they will take a lot away. And I also know they will enjoy your book. So yeah, huge thank you, and good luck with all of the promotion.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.